Evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to have you all here. The title of this whole thing is something like Religious Experience, Narrative, and Analysis. And what that clever title means is that we're going to be dealing with the whole question of religious experience during this 6 weeks lecture series. And we're doing it through important people, much as I have done in other series. I am more and more convinced that it helps to look at flesh and blood individuals to help us to see ourselves better. Instead of talking so much in abstractions, it seems to help if we are looking at real people and how they've managed their lives and so on. So I think that methodology has worked well in the past, and I intend to use it again. And throughout this whole series. So we'll be dealing with people like Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day and Teresa of Avila and C.S. Lewis and others that seem to escape me at the moment. Paul Tillich, yes, is another one. And as always, I'm interested in all of this not just as a sort of academic study, but really as an attempt to understand ourselves better. So the whole of the theological enterprise in my mind has to do with self-understanding, self-awareness, which is supposed to lead to more responsible behavior in one way or another. So I am hoping that what we have to say in here touches people's minds and hearts and moves us in the direction of a deeper kind of self-awareness. So we'll be using that technique that I've used before, which I have borrowed from John Donne and call passing over and return to self. We'll be trying to crawl behind the eyes of these marvelous people, see the world the way they saw it for a while, and then return to ourselves, we hope, enriched and better able to cope and to understand. One of my premises in all of this flows out of my own theological understanding, which is that fundamentally the theology of Karl Rahner that says we live in one graced world, that God's grace is sort of percolating up all over the world, that it happens in people's minds and hearts, and some of the great people around, the people we call prophets and poets and so on, the saints, they are able to be in touch with that experience and to articulate it in some ways that make sense to us and sort of attract us and help us to understand in a better way. Now, the person we're going to deal with tonight is Thomas Merton. In a way, Merton could be used for all of the types of religious experience we're going to be dealing with. In fact, I've taught a course in the past just on Merton in which he helped us to understand the conversion experience, the mystical experience, the boundary experience, experience of joy and ecstasy, all those things that we're going to take throughout. Merton is terrific at. He is the complete kind of religious person in many ways. We'll be presuming nothing throughout this. Someone asked me beforehand, well, can we come in here cold or do we have to read 4 books ahead of time? And I said, no, you just, shall I presuppose nothing? We'll start from total scratch with these people. We got seats right in front for you. Welcome. Some important books for people who are into books. Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain, of course, his autobiography. We'll be talking about that. And the ones that are important for our understanding now, Zen and the Birds of Appetite, which I will be commenting on, and The Way of Chuang Tzu, another book of Merton, both dealing with the Eastern type experiences. And then we also, there's all kind of commentaries coming out on Merton now. 15 years after his death, we got this tremendous interest in this man. I got to get a hold of one, Anthony Padovano. Some of you know him. He has a new book out, The Human Journey, Thomas Merton, Symbol of a Century. And it's a very fine study of Merton by a very fine theologian, Anthony Padovano. And interestingly enough, the really definitive biography of Merton will be coming out soon. I'm told it's at the printers now, or at the publishers, and that's being done by a professor down at Bowling Green State University by the name of Michael Mott. And within the year, I suppose you will be seeing reviews of this book all over the place. I imagine it will make a splash. It's he has had access to all the material on Merton, and will give us what promises to be the definitive biography of Thomas Merton. So, person right close by doing that, Michael Mott. Okay, let us now get into this fellow's life a bit, and anybody standing, we do have seats if you want any. I'm sure people can move in a bit here and along the way. Make sure that people can sit down. Yeah, we do have someone looking for a seat there, and some people in the back could sit down or move in. That would help. We're actually moving this to Centennial Hall next week. Okay, Thomas Merton. I just, for those who don't know anything about him, I just go over briefly his biography. Then I'm going to highlight a few individual things. People still coming in, so if people in the back could move in there and some of those rows so that they could see where there's seats, that would help. Okay, we're dealing with a 20th century figure here. Merton was born in 1915. He had a very troubled childhood. His mother died when he was 6, and his father died when he was about 16, and so on. He moved all around. He was born in France, came to the United States, lived in Long Island for a while, was back to Europe, lived in England, and so on. Very troubled kind of existence. Went to Cambridge University, that what we often call the other place in England, and spent about a year there. Then he came to Columbia University, where he lived the life of the intellectual in New York. It's just sort of exciting to hear about it. You know, they were out drinking every night and having these heavy conversations and so on, and into exciting things. He had his Marxist period where he became a communist or went to some meetings and so on, and dabbled in Freudian psychology. And while he was at Columbia, he was really an important man. He was I think, editor of their student paper, and he was writing book reviews for the New York Times in those early years and so on. So it was sort of a wild life. Commonly thought that Merton did have an illegitimate child during that time while he was in England, and that the mother and the child were killed in one of the bombing raids in London. I think Michael Mott will probably answer that sort of definitively in his biography coming out. So we have this man, living this sort of flamboyant kind of life, and then suddenly none of that life looked good to him, and in 19 he began reading some Thomistic philosophy. Someone gave him a book by Jill Sohn, a sort of a modern Thomistic philosopher, and he's reading that, and he starts thinking. He encountered a few professors at Columbia University who were into scholastic thought, St. Thomas Aquinas, all of that. He began thinking about all that stuff, and lo and behold, in 1938 he becomes a Catholic. And after that, I guess the most important thing occurred in 1940. He took a trip to Cuba, and while he was at Cuba, he had a really strong mystical experience while he was in St. Francis Church there in Havana. And then in 1941, a couple days after Pearl Harbor, he decides to enter the Trappist Monastery. There's this guy who's known this wild life, suddenly decides to go into a monastery, renounces all this, and sure enough shows up there and enters. And that's where he really substantially lives the rest of his life. There were a few other important incidents that occurred at that time, which I will comment on as I go along while he was in that monastery. But then finally he got out for a while and traveled to the east, which is the whole import of what we're doing here. Goes to India and various places, and finally then in Bangkok, Thailand in 1968, that fateful year when Robert Kennedy was assassinated and Martin Luther King, and where we had the Tet Offensive, that such an important year and such a sad year, so many ways. He was tragically electrocuted. He had given an important paper the morning before on Marxism and monasticism, and everyone was just waiting for the question period that evening. He went up to his room, really at the prime of his life in many ways, and so on, and had a shower and got out of the shower and pulled the cord on an electric fan and was electrocuted. They found him laying there with the fan still running on top of him in December of 1968. Brought back to Gethsemane and buried there. So that's roughly what we're talking about. I guess the thing I missed in the whole business there was the publication of Seven Storey Mountain. That's when he became famous. In 1948, he published that book, and it made a splash, surprisingly so, and was on the New York Times bestseller list. I think it moved up as high as number 3. Tremendous. Thousands of copies sold. I'm trying to think of a parallel now. I'm not sure if we have anything exactly along that line, but that's what catapulted him into fame, and from then on he was doing his various writing and so on. Okay, that's sort of an overview of the life of Merton. Now, I want to look at, we ought to be able to find seats for these people here, shouldn't we? By people moving into the centers and so on. Why don't you come down? I hate to see people wilting away as I talk, you know. It seems to inhibit me. They're wavering. There they go. Better hurry up. Is all that on tape? I mean, couldn't we erase some of those comments? It's never, yeah. Okay, now let's look at some of these experiences here, and that I think shaped Merton and opened up this whole thing to the east. First, definitely with his mother. That whole experience of being uprooted and moving around left him with a sense of homelessness. When his mother was going to die, she realized it was going to be a hard time for him. He's only 6 years old. What she did was write him a letter and tell him that indeed this was going to happen and that she did not want to see him again until after she had died. And so it was that he didn't. She kept him at length. She didn't want him to see her suffering. And his remembrances of that are so difficult. He remembers she evidently was cremated afterwards. And his remembrance was it was raining and he's outside the crematorium and he's all by himself, alone. There seems to be no pulling together at that time. He went through the death of his mother in just a horrible, agonizing kind of way. And I think this has a tremendous effect on him from then on, this sense of homelessness, of being alone. Many years later, he recalls that scene of this fact that he was kept at a distance from his mother during this time. He said himself that that's how he dealt with his relationships. He had to keep people at a distance. He was often very afraid of allowing people in close into his life. I suppose a sense of perhaps being hurt again. His mother was harsh with him. He remembers her, those were not happy times. He remembers her being very critical of him and not liking the way he behaved very often. Okay, then there is the question of his father. His father was an artistic type. Traveling, I used to read him Blake's poetry as the young man was growing up. And he was often gone. So after his mother died, for the next 10 years, he's sort of in and out with his father. His father takes off for Europe after that. He's over there trying to make a living in his artwork. And Tom is left with his grandparents in Long Island. They said it was the most miserable years of his life. Longed for his father. The few weekends he'd be together with his father were fantastic. Really terrific things for him. Then he did get taken to France. He thought everything's going to be fine. His father's going to build a house, and then that goes down the drain. For some reason, the house is never completed, and he's shipped off to England. He's away from his father there. 15, 16 years old, something like that, and one day he gets a telegram. Telegram is rather incoherent, but it's from his father. His father's mind was already going. He was dying. And he could tell from the telegram that happened. Again, he was left alone, and his father did indeed die. Then, couple years, not too long after that, it was really 1931, would he have been 16 then? Yeah, he's traveling in Rome. And I'm going to read to you a number of things from Merton. He writes so well, and a powerful expression of this. So, his father died, right, and he's feeling terrible about it, feels all alone again. He's now in Rome. Quote, I was in my room. It was night. The light was on. Suddenly it seemed to me that Father, who had now been dead more than a year, was there with me. The sense of his presence was as vivid and as startling as if he had touched my arm or spoken to me. The whole thing passed in a flash, but in that flash, instantly, I was overwhelmed with a sudden and profound insight into the misery and corruption of my own soul. And I was pierced deeply with a light that made me realize something of the condition I was in. And I was filled with horror at what I saw. My whole being rose up in revolt against what was within me. And my soul desired escape and liberation and freedom from all this with an intensity and an urgency unlike I had ever known before. And now I think for the first time in my whole life, I really began to pray. Praying not with my lips and my intellect and my imagination, but praying out of the very roots of my life and my being, and praying to God, the God that I had never known, to reach down towards me out of his darkness and to help me to get free of the thousand terrible things that held my will in their slavery. Well, he was an extremely rebellious youth. Really needed to define himself over against all the authority figures in his life. I think we could say that that moment of encountering his father really was the beginning of the conversion experience in his life. He didn't grow up with religion at all, knew very little of any of that. Nothing explicit. His father was into art and big on the aesthetic experience, but not really spiritual experience. Beginning of his conversion, I think, right there. Now his relationship with his brother John Paul, who was 3 years younger. This again is a painful relationship. Everything's difficult in his early life. Here's his remembrance later on of this whole thing with John Paul. And I will read you sections of this. Here's what later on, he remembers this scene from his youth. The picture I get is of my brother John Paul standing in a field about 100 yards away from the clump of trees where we had built our hut. And here's this perplexed 5-year-old kid in short pants and a kind of leather jacket standing quite still with his arms hanging down at his sides and gazing in our direction, afraid to come any nearer on account of the stones, as insulted as he is saddened, and his eyes full of indignation and sorrow. And yet he does not go away. We shout at him to get out of there, to beat it, and he does not go away. We tell him to go play in some other place. He does not move. And there he stands, not sobbing, not crying, but angry and unhappy and offended and tremendously sad. The law written in his nature says he must be with his elder brother and do what he is doing, and he cannot understand why this law of love is being so wildly and unjustly violated in this case. Many times it was like that. His remembrance of his relationship with his younger brother is no room for him. Push him away, keep him aside. He goes to the monastery. John Paul comes to visit him. Turns out to be the last time they will see one another. He flashes on this, and he wants to meet him someplace. I don't remember, all the details aren't clear to me, but he's in another part of the monastery, and he can't find to where he's going. He's standing there all alone. John Paul is perplexed, and Merton's over there trying to wave to him and get his attention so he can get in touch with him. He writes something like this. Well, he's recalling that scene now, and he says, "At that moment there flashed in my mind all the scores of times in our forgotten childhood when I had chased John Paul away with stones from the place where my friends and I were building a hut. And now all of a sudden, here it was all over again, a situation that was externally of the same pattern. John Paul standing confused and unhappy at a distance which he was not able to bridge." And then as he leaves, he says that he has flashes of this later on. Same image haunts me now, this is writing after his brother is dead, as though my brother's standing there in purgatory, helpless, depending more or less on me to get him out of there, waiting for my prayers. And then it was when he was in the monastery, John Paul, when he left there, went off in the war. He was in the Air Force and was shot down in the sea and died during the Second World War. He never saw him again. And afterwards, Merton wrote a lot of poetry. And Padovano's theory is that you can best understand Merton by getting at his poetry, because that's when his real guts is poured out and his really, the symbols and images come out. And here's what a poem he wrote for his brother afterwards. Sweet brother, if I do not sleep, my eyes are flowers for your tomb. He can't sleep. He's bothered with his image. His open eyes are flowers for your tomb. And if I cannot eat my bread, my fast shall live like willows where you died. If in the heat I find no water for my thirst shall turn to springs for you, poor traveler. Where in what desolate and smoky country lies your poor body lost and dead? And in what landscape of disaster has your unhappy spirit lost its road? His brother was actually buried at sea, and that seemed to bother him a lot, that he didn't have a place that he knew that he was. Well, tough growing up period for him. A lot of pain in those relationships. I think what is commonly thought is that all of that distancing, all that aloneness and so on, really was part of what moved him to search out the Trappists and the monastery and to take on the special relationship he had with his abbots. His abbots were really father figures for him as he searched this out. Next little story that might bring to mind is in 1938, same year he got baptized, his first encounter with Eastern religions. He was typical of the time, dabbling. They're reading the end things, Zen Buddhism and all this. And there was a big conference in 1933 in Chicago, World Conference on Religion. I forget the exact title of it. But one of the monks from India came over for that conference. Ended up staying in Chicago afterwards, got his PhD at the University of Chicago. Some of Merton's friends got to know him, and sure enough, they invited him to New York, and Merton encountered this fellow. And he was very favorably impressed after an initial bad reaction. He loved to talk to this guy, learned about some of his practices in the Eastern religions and so on. And this monk told him an interesting thing. He says, you don't read all this Eastern stuff. Go back and read your Western masters. Read Augustine and Imitation of Christ and so on. That's what Merton remembered from that whole encounter, and that's indeed what he did. But he had a very positive experience. He thought that this man was a holy man. As we're going to see as we go along, one of Merton's constant conflicts was whether to let his heart rule or his head. And his head was truly messed up in many ways theologically. The question was, should he let his heart, his intuitions? He had a marvelous intuition of the goodness of this monk. But the theology he was learning at this time told him that had to be bad, that what he was into was paganism. He was a pagan monk, and therefore it couldn't be anything good about him. And that, as we will see, creates a big part of his dilemma. I might subtitle this whole lecture, Journey to Openness. Because during this time, Merton really was closed-minded. As he became a Catholic, he learned the old classical Catholicism. He learned what we call the Neo-Thomists, Gilson and Merton and those kind of people. Remember, Merton didn't like the Second Vatican Council at all. Didn't like the openness in the Catholic Church. They wanted things pretty carefully defined. That's what Merton learned. Thomas Aquinas in that form. And that, for him, the nature-grace question, grace was only like in the church. Grace was only for the baptized. There was no grace out here in the world of Hinduism and Buddhism and Chinese religion and so on. And yet his heart told him that Dr. Brahmachari, as he called him, the Hindu monk, really was a fine person, good person. So they're a big part of his conflict. Then 1940, the mystical experience in Cuba. Maybe we'll save that. We're going to take up mystical experience later on. Well, this might give you a little feel for it. He's in this church, St. Francis in Havana, 1940s, baptized a Catholic now into this sort of rigid scholastic outlook. And he's in the church, and it's First Communion time, and all these little kids are going up, I think, for First Communion, if I remember the story correctly. And then there was a recitation of the Creed, which I think set it off, and suddenly he had this mystical experience. I'll just read you parts of it. But what a thing it was, this awareness. It was so intangible, and yet it struck me like a thunderclap. It was a light that was so bright that it had no relation to any visible light, and so profound and so intimate that it seemed like a neutralization of every lesser experience. And yet the thing that struck me most of all was that this light was, in a sense, ordinary. It was a light, and this most of all was what took my breath away, that was offered to all, to everybody. And there was nothing fancy or strange about it. It was the light of faith, deepened and reduced to an extreme and sudden obviousness. It was as if I had been suddenly illuminated by being blinded by the manifestation of God's presence. And it goes on to say, it was purified of all emotion and cleansed of everything that savored of sensible yearnings. It was love as clean and direct as vision, and it flew straight to the possession of the truth it loved. It lasted only a moment, but it left a breathless joy and a clean peace and happiness that stayed for hours, and it was something I have never forgotten. When we take the mystical experience, you might recall that because it's got all the elements of the classic experience right in that short summary there. All right, he gets into the monastery December 9th, 1941. It's sort of an uneventful life. I don't think they live a too thrilling existence in there. You know, they're getting up at odd hours and canning the office and all of that. He was ordained a priest then in 1949. And one other vignette I'll take out of all of that, which will highlight an important part of his personality. The abbots gave him a tough time, often. His first abbot encouraged him to write. That's why he wrote Seven Storey Mountain. But some of the other abbots he had didn't want him writing. Brought too much sort of fame to the monastery. They might see it as an ego trip for him. It was too much clutter. People kept wanting to visit down there, and they were breaking up all their silence and everything. They really didn't want him to do all of that. And so, this Abbot Fox in 1956, I don't know if he really initiated this or whose idea it was, but they contacted a psychiatrist and who was going to a conference in Milwaukee, the same place that Merton was going. And they sent the psychiatrist some of his writings to analyze it for abnormalities, and got him into cahoots in their plan that he would tell Merton fundamentally that he was crazy, and so on. So they arranged this meeting with the abbot knew about it. It's so sordid. I guess it's hard to believe this kind of thing would go on in a monastery. But here it was. Merton's out for once in the monastery, going to this conference and so on. They arranged a meeting with the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist just blasts him no end. He tells him that he's on an ego trip, that he's compulsive in his writing. He says the only reason he's a hermit is to get publicity. He told him that the best thing for you to do is go put your hermitage up in the middle of Times Square and put a big sign up above it, Thomas Merton, Hermit. Merton was devastated, totally done in. The abbot's comment was, I never saw a human being crumble like I saw on that occasion. Totally done in by this experience. tears and all of this. Eventually, Merton never knew throughout his whole life that that whole thing was a put-on and arranged. Very sad kind of story in this whole monastic tradition here we're dealing with. The reason I tell that particular story is to highlight what the importance writing was for Merton. One of the theories is the reason it did him in is because it cut at his writing. His writing was what he was. Some people have said he was more a writer than a monk. He had to write to stay alive. He once wrote that if I couldn't write, I would go crazy. It was his outlet. It was his way of dealing with his loneliness. Terrible loneliness man suffered. And writing was his way of coming to grips with all of that. He wrote incessantly. He wrote a lot of this, I think, Michael Mott has seen and probably no one else has ever seen. That's why it's going to be interesting to observe what comes out in the book. But Merton once said that he was so ruthlessly honest in the journals that no one will ever be able to think of him as a saint when it comes out. That he told everything about what was wrong with himself. And he had this almost compulsive need to sort of put it out there in some objective fashion. And even knowing that some people would get a hold of it someday. Made no provisions to get rid of that writing at all. And we will probably find out before long what is in some of the journals that others have not been able to see. Writing is crucial. Whenever he went on a trip or anything, he was always at these notebooks, keeping these journals. A lot of the writings we have amount to the published form of those. Some of you are looking for seats. We have seats down here. Join us. Because I see a few right here. Come on down. Good. Right before you collapsed. Thank goodness. Okay, now I'm into this whole business of the move to the east. You start out with this very closed attitude that really Hinduism, Buddhism, and all that is really nothing to him but a pagan religion, full of falsehoods. That's the only thing that his theory would allow him to deal with. Then in the late 50s, he was ordained, what I say, in the late 40s, now moving along in the monastery, and he dies in 68, so he keeps some frame here. Late 50s, he begins reading some of the Zen masters. He was, when he'd get into something, he was voracious. He'd find all the books he could get. The libraries couldn't keep him supplied enough, and he began reading in Zen Buddhism at this time. Became more and more interested in it. He even tried to learn Chinese, so he'd be able to read that directly. He had to abandon that effort. He never did succeed. He was very good at languages, but he didn't master Chinese. He interacted with a fellow, one of the great Buddhist scholars, D.T. Suzuki. Some people have read some of his books, perhaps. He's considered one of the foremost experts on Zen Buddhism. Sent him some of his material, and they began to correspond, and Suzuki made a trip to the United States one time, and they got to talk. And that some of that correspondence is published, and really is a striking kind of dialogue. So what's Merton doing? He's keeping his mind open. He's beginning to explore this whole world that he thought was closed to him before. 1965, he wrote that book I told you about, which he often called himself one of his favorite books, The Way of Chuang Tzu. I will read you little sections of that as we go along here. The delightful little book. Okay, that sort of sets the stage. Now, then what happens is, as he's going along, he finally gets this invitation to go to the East, to travel there, and it's sort of like a dream come true. He's going to visit his Buddhist monasteries and talk to the Dalai Lama, which he did on 3 occasions, get a real feel for this Eastern thought, immerse himself in it. So he takes off, in the fall of 68, and he begins the journal by saying, "And I'm going home." I'm going home to where this suit of clothes and this body never was before. Interesting comment. He felt that this travel east, I was going home. He'd never been there. He had no real affinity for it before. Going home. Led many people to think that indeed he intended not to come back to Gethsemane, to the monastery. I've talked to one person who talked to him right before he got on the boat, the ship to go. No, yeah, he saw him in San Francisco before he took off. Brother David Steindelrast, some of you might have heard him talk. And he told me himself that Merton confided in him that indeed he did intend to come back and so on. There's a lot of rumors that he wouldn't, but he really put those aside. And in the Asian Journals, which is on this whole topic, he clearly says that indeed his home is the Trappist and he will end up returning. But that was a big rumor at that time. He was going to quit the church and all of that. I don't think that really was ever true. I'm going home to the home I never was before. Well, let's. I just tell you one other vignette. When he's there, I forget the place exactly, but he goes where these gigantic statues of the Buddha are. I've seen the pictures of them, and one is the Buddha reclining. Another gigantic thing, and he begins to tell about his experience. He looks at the faces of the Buddha, and he sees this great serenity on them, and he's taken by it. And then he writes something like, and then it was I knew why I had come to Asia. In that experience, he had seen something revealed to him about the divine human relationships in the faces of those gigantic statues of the Buddha. So it was not simply an intellectual exercise, it was something that touched him deeply and really was at the core of his own being. We'll have to see more about what that was. And then I did finish the story for you. He gave that lecture in Bangkok and died right after that. As I say, I think at the height of his powers, the journey was to openness. Oh, and that's where it took him to the east. Now let's look a bit at two kinds of thought that captured him. The first is the Chinese thought as represented in Chuang Tzu. If anyone is spelling that, it's Chuangtzu. The Chinese is very difficult. I happen to have a friend who's studying Chinese who tells me how to pronounce all of these things, but it's a very difficult language. Well, Chuang Tzu died around 275. I think there's always a little bit of vacillation in those dates. BC, so you locate him a little bit. He's a follower of Taoism. Tao is spelled T-A-O. You do not pronounce that Tao. That's Taoism. And Taoism, is very difficult to understand, but we will look at it through some of Chuang Tzu's ideas here. I think that, I don't know if you need to get located just a little bit more. Probably yes. In China, you had in the 6th century BC. 6th century BC was one of the most important times in the whole history of the world. Then you had some of the greatest people living who ever lived. The Buddha lived at that time, Confucius, Lao Tzu. It was a tremendous flowering of religious insight during that 6th century BC. Well, Confucius was very much of an ethical person. He was trying to figure out how the ethical person ought to live, the noble person. And his thought ended up being sort of formalized. And so you got in China, following Confucius, all kind of tiny rules about how you should act in public, what you should do, and it became almost a straitjacket and sort of a tight, rigid system by the time of Chuang Tzu. The other line comes down from Lao Tzu and what we call the Tao Te Ching, and writings about how government ought to operate and so on. And now this tradition, instead of just being formal and ethical on how you ought to live, has much more of a mystical side to it. Much more of the inner life that they're interested in. And of course, Merton would not write his book about Confucius. Confucius is too practical, ethical, and all that. The one who fascinates him is Chuang Tzu. Chuang Tzu had no use for a lot of the Confucian kinds of formalism. I'm going to read you some of these things here to give you a little feel for this. Merton translated this, and he really, even though he didn't know Chinese, he read a lot of different versions and put it together. And so we get into Merton's mind, what was it in Chuang Tzu that he liked? And for our purposes, what is there that might help us to see ourselves better? This one is entitled Three Friends. Chuang Tzu was like a satirist, made fun of the formalism, was an earthy person, and that's how Merton was. Earthy kind of individual. So he writes, there were three friends discussing life. One said, can men live together and know nothing of it? Work together and produce nothing? Can they fly around in space and forget to exist, world without end? The three friends looked at each other and burst out laughing. They had no explanation. Thus, they were better friends than before. Then one friend died. Confucius, remember the background here, Confucius sent a disciple to help the other two chant his funeral rites. The disciple found that one friend had composed a song while the other played a lute, and they sang, "Hey Sung-Hu, where'd you go? Hey Sung-Hu, where'd you go? You have gone where you really were, and we are here. Damn it, we are here." Then the disciples of Confucius burst in on them and exclaimed, "May I inquire where you found this in the official rubrics for funeral rites? This frivolous caroling in the presence of the departed?" The two friends looked at each other and laughed. "Poor fellow," they said, "he doesn't know the new liturgy." Might have started with a biggie there. Should have built to that. So, one of the things Merton likes and Chuang Tzu was into was against formalism, against the rigid structures of life. Merton liked that. Merton loved ritual and liturgy, was into it, but never wanted it to become an end in itself. Probably if we tried hard, we might find a lesson there someplace. Here's another one. I think that Merton really saw Chuang Tzu as a way of getting around the competitive culture in which we live. Chuang Tzu was not into being number one. No, that wasn't important to him. He says here, when an archer is shooting for nothing, he has all his skill. If he shoots for a brass buckle, he's already nervous. If he shoots for a prize of gold, he goes blind or sees two targets, he's out of his mind. His skill has not changed, but the prize divides him. He cares. Important line there. He cares. He thinks more of winning than of shooting. And the need to win drains him of power. So Merton saw in Chuang Tzu a person who would cut into the competitive world in which we live, the success ethic in the United States society, the desire to be number one, and so on. Merton was a strong cultural critic. You know, the collection of one of his sets of essays is called Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. He never thought he did enough, in other words, and he looked at the social scene, peace problem. He was very active in the peace movement and so on, Vietnam War and all that. Never felt he really did enough. Conjectures of a guilty bystander. But he felt the contradictions of the culture. He really felt what was wrong with his world. And Chuang Tzu helped him to see through that, I think. Okay, let me read you another one here. This is called Two Kings and No Form. The South Sea King was named Act on your hunch. The North Sea king was named Act in a Flash. The king of the place between them was named No Form. Now, South Sea king and North Sea king used to go together often to the land of No Form. He treated them well. So they consulted together. They thought up a good turn, a pleasant surprise for No Form, in token of appreciation. Men, they said, have 7 openings for seeing, hearing, eating, breathing, and so on. But No Form has no openings. Let's make him a few holes. So after that, they put holes in No Form, 1 a day for 7 days. And when they finished the 7th opening, their friend lay dead. Leo Tan said, to organize is to destroy. Chuang Tzu was not big on systems and organizations. Chuang Tzu thought that those sort of things got in the way, and so did Merton. That's what attracted him about this. Didn't like stereotyping and pigeonholing and trying to order everything neatly and clearly. He had a greater sense of the flux and flow of life, and that, as a matter of fact, it was destructive to try to organize everything in rigid patterns, that it just can't happen like that. Read you another one here. This is sort of long. I'm going to have to excerpt this, but it's got some marvelous phrases here. Well, maybe I better cut it down. When Prince Wen Hu's cook was cutting up an ox, out went a hand, down went a shoulder, he planted a foot, he pressed with a knee, the ox fell apart with a whisper, the bright cleaver murmured like a gentle wind, rhythm, timing like a sacred dance. Good work, the prince exclaimed, your method is faultless. Method, said the cook, laying aside his cleaver, what I follow is the Tao, which is beyond all methods. And he goes on to explain how he cuts up the ox, how he does this butchering task. He says a good cook needs a new chopper once a year. He cuts. A poor cook needs a new one every month. He hacks. I have used the same cleaver 19 years. Cut up 1,000 oxen. And the edge is as keen as if newly sharpened. And then he goes on to say how he does this again. He says, then I withdraw the blade, I stand still, and let the joy of the work sink in. I cleaned the blade and put it away. And the prince said, this is it. My cook has shown me how I ought to live my own life. Again, for Merton, what captured him about this was the spontaneity of it all, the living in harmony. One of the things, of course, that Chinese thought is after is this sense of harmony about life. You know, we have the whole yin-yang thing. You know, you've seen that circle, which has part of it is white and the other equal part is black, representing 2 different complementary things that always make up life. The yin-yang is fundamental to Chinese thought. Just to locate that a little bit, in Hindu thought, you've got what we call Advaita Hinduism, which is a monism. That is, for them, everything's one. The fact that we seem to be apart is simply an illusion. We're all one. Pantheism, gods and the whole thing. That's one line of thought that's available in our world. What we call a monism, one. No, the divisions are all illusions. In our Western world, we have another idea, and that is we have the collision of opposites. We have a feminist movement, that needs to define itself over against the male-dominated society. We often view, and I talk this way, so much of my own talks have to do with the dialectical tension that exists in life. And keeping that tension in a fruitful sort of interaction. Many people in the room have heard me say that so often. I think that really is typically Western. It is a dualism, but it is a sort of a conflictual dualism. Chinese thought, the yin-yang, is what I would call a complementary dualism. For them, they aren't in conflict, the two are in harmony. In other words, in one sense, they wouldn't understand a feminist movement. That wouldn't make any sense for anybody to find themselves over against in any way. That just wouldn't be. That's not what life is about. Yin-yang, the two aren't fighting one another. The two aren't in competition. They're just there, existing together. The Tao, which is the ultimate principle of reality, if we can say it that way, the ultimate harmony out of which everything grows, is sort of the power that is working out this yin-yang complementary character throughout life. The Tao, when they use that term, means the fundamental principle. I mean, they don't talk this way, but if we were to say it, we might say, well, it's like what we mean by God. It's the ultimate, the Tao. The Tao is beyond all thinking, beyond all knowledge. It's another reason Merton likes Chuang Tzu, because the Tao couldn't be comprehended. You couldn't parse it out. You couldn't say, I have a hold of it. It's too big for that. What you had to do was get in union with the Tao, get in harmony, and that's what the meat cutter had. The meat cutter didn't have to think what he was doing. No, he didn't have to try to figure it all out. The meat cutter just let it flow. That's what Chuang Tzu wanted. Let it all flow. Come out of the inner. Don't block it in any way. What really causes us trouble is the blockage in life. And Merton, of course, loved that. That was so important to Merton, to get away from the obstacles so that the divine life could some ways flow out. Now, maybe enough for Chuang Tzu, and there's some other marvelous things in here. I hate to pass them up, but you have to do something else. Now, let's look a bit at Zen Buddhism for Merton. Buddhism, just to locate us again, the Buddha lived 6th century B.C. It was a great enlightenment experience, sitting under the Bodhi tree. I think it's often dated around 560 or so. A great moment when he understood what life was all about. And he proclaimed the Four Noble Truths, that life is pain and suffering, that the cause of the pain and suffering in life is craving, wanting, desiring, obsessions like that. That's what causes the real pain of life, wanting. It's like the thirst that one would have after one's out in the desert. I guess that's what the word in its original meaning is. And that the third truth is that the way to get around this is to get rid of the craving. Quit wanting so much. In fact, to ultimately get rid of every bit of craving in oneself. And the fourth truth was that he knew how to do it. You did it through right conduct, right meditation, and so on. That is the fundamental, I think all Buddhist thought in some way grows out of those four noble truths, as he called it. Now, Zen Buddhism is an offshoot of all of that. And as for Merton, just to give you the slant that interested him, he wasn't interested so much in Buddhism as a religion, like what their sacred texts were or how they functioned so much in the monastery. He was interested in what he called Zen, which he considered not to be so much a religion, but a whole approach to life. Read you some phrases. Zen is consciousness unstructured by particular systems. It's not just identified with Buddhism. Zen consciousness is like a mirror which reflects whatever is before it. It does not distinguish and categorize. He likes Jesus' statement, judge not, to be understood not just in an ethical way, but in an order of knowledge. Don't get into judgment. Let me try to tell you a little bit of the way D.T. Suzuki analyzes this. He figures that the real original sin was when people got out of the state of innocence, where innocence meant you were pure of heart. You just drank in reality. You didn't analyze it, didn't categorize it, didn't get a system around it or anything. Adam and Eve were just there. And the great temptation and the real sin was to move from innocence to knowledge. Knowledge is what hurts. Knowledge begins to categorize and systematize and can stereotype and so on. Knowledge is what is the result of original sin. You notice what Merton says here, that Zen is into this no consciousness. Is trying to get back behind that experience where we try to parse everything out. Suzuki distinguishes innocence, which is what we're striving for, and away from knowledge, which often gets in our way. Part of this is to get rid of ego. It's to get rid of our own self-seeking. In fact, the Buddhists think that there is no self, that the ultimate illusion is that there's a self in here that's doing all this stuff. Their doctrine is called anatma, no self. That's you got to get rid of everything. Craving, but the craving especially to be a self, to be an individual. Let me tell you a Buddhist parable. Some of you have heard me tell this before, so bear with me. Buddhist story. There is, in fact, did I say this in this class last time? Jeez, stop me. If this Zen master Gutai lived in the village, I better tell it anyway for those who weren't here. Lived in a village. He's a good man. I did tell it, sorry. And he's got a marvelous reputation. Everybody loves him. A young girl in the village gets pregnant. She doesn't want to tell her parents who the real father is, so she says, Gutai is the father. So his parents go to Gutai and say, how could you do this? You're a monk. You're supposed to, you got our daughter pregnant. What's wrong with you? They yelled at him and everything. And Gutai looked at him and he said, is that so? Time went on. His reputation was ruined throughout the whole village. Hardly anyone would come to see him. One time someone came and says, you're a lousy, no good. This is terrible, look at it, and really tore him down. And Gutai looked at him and said, is that so? One day the young girl could contain herself no more. She went to her parents and told them, Gutai is not the father. This other young man is the father. Parents were stricken. It ruined Gutai's reputation, ruined his whole life. They were filled with remorse. Said, what shall we do? We'll go and apologize. They come to Gutai. They walk in and they say, we're sorry. We have just found out the truth. We apologize for this. We hope you accept that. And Gutai looked at them and said, is that so? That's the end. Isn't any more to that story. This is what we call detachment. You see? This is the ideal that is put forward. No self. Not to have oneself involved in all of this. No, the self has to be put aside. And in fact, you're not supposed to rejoice. He's not supposed to say, well, it's about time you figured this out, Or how could you ruin my reputation like that? I never did anything. Never that he's above that. That's having Zen consciousness. That's where they want to get to. They use these little things they call mandos. The Zen people work in question form. The master, you have to have a master. He says, what's the sound of one hand clapping? That's supposed to challenge your consciousness so that you don't look at the world always in the same way. One of the mandos is the novice comes to the master and says, well, who is the Buddha? And the master looks at him and says, who are you? Meaning, that's the whole thing again, meaning that the Buddha consciousness is in you. Buddha in their religion is not seen somehow as a savior figure so much, but as an inviter to go through the same enlightenment experience that they call satori. You go through that same kind of thing where they let go of self and where they break through. That's what they're after. All that training in the monastery, all having this master, all these koans, what's on one hand clapping, all these mondos, these questions and so on, all of that is designed to break through the ordinary consciousness, and so we get to this pure, deeper way of seeing the world, which is really a direct experience of the world. So we put aside detachments. Into Buddhist stories. Love these stories. You know the one about the two monks? They're at the river, and they are ready to cross, and here comes this young lady. She can't get across. So the one monk, who isn't supposed to have anything to do with women, nothing, he reaches over, picks her up, carries her over to the other side, leaves her off, and the two monks go on their journey. Well, the second monk just can't contain himself anymore. Just is outraged at this behavior of his brother monk. Finally, he asks the question, says, why did you ever do that? Pick up a woman, you're not even supposed to look at a woman, let alone touch one. And the other monk looked at him and he says, look, he says, I picked her up, carried her over, and set her down, and I left her there. But you are continuing to carry her in your head. Again, the whole business of detachment brought out again in the Buddhist story. Well, I must limit myself here to these next 8 pages of notes on Zen Buddhism. What is it that Merton liked about all that? What did he get out of it that was so important to him? One, he felt that in the United States we're in too much of a spectator posture. We're always observing other people are doing it. We're watching football games and sitting there passively. We're just looking at other people doing things. Spectator society. And what he liked about Buddhism, that it wouldn't allow that. Buddhism kept saying, no, it's the direct experience. You've got to get in there and go through it yourself. You can't just read about the Buddha. You've got to have the Satori experience yourself. Seems as though that is one way that Merton could see that they spoke to us, challenged the spectator notion. Another way, I think, is to make sure that experience for us is primary and becomes in front of all theology and systems and so on. Many of you have heard me say in the past that theology is a secondary exercise. You can do well without theologians like me. What we can't do without is experience of the Spirit, without experience of grace, without immersion in life. That's what really counts. So all systems, all liturgies, all doctrines, all dogmas, theologies, are always secondary kinds of activities. And the other thing that Merton loved about all this was its mystical sense that indeed one is trying to get rid of the false self. Merton said that's what prayer is all about. In prayer, we're peeling away the layers of the false self, trying to get to the true self. When we get to the true self, then God will be found there. How could I have forgotten it? But anyway, introspection. Yeah, I like another word there. Yes, right. I understand that. Yeah. 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 I. Yes, right. Yes, right. I agree with that. Yeah. And. Yeah. I know. No, but one phrase comes to my mind that he wrote in 7-Story Mountain when he encountered that guy from the east. One of the phrases he used, he said, When I met him, it was like an electric shock. When he met Dr. Brahmachari. No, in Martin Luther King, a person like that, you had talk and speeches that made it sound like they were expecting death and so on. Everything you read in the Asian journals indicates Merton thought life was going on and making all these plans and doing his journal for the future, planning books, looking for a new hermitage and so on. I find none of that. The other phrase just happened to strike me about the Asian being, it was like an electric shock when he saw this guy. I don't think so. I think it's a random event. I don't think he had any premonition of that. I don't know anybody else who has said anything along that line. Yeah, I think that my sense of the experience when he was in the East, when he was with the Buddha statues, carvings, I have the sense that probably was one of those. Yeah, there's other strong experiences that he recounts. Yeah, I think that I don't know that it ever had what we might call the pristine power of that first experience. I don't know if it ever does for mystics after that. The first one is so overwhelming, I'm not sure that anything else really takes its place in a way. But yeah, I think he did. I would say that one when the Buddha statue sounds to me like that. Who seems more peaceful, Meister Eckhart? Yes. Well, many people feel that. I mean, Eckhart is different from most Western mystics. I better be careful here because we're going to do a whole class on mysticism. I better not say a whole lot, but he really is different than the other mystics in the West. He's the one the Easterners like the best. So if Suzuki was looking for a dialogue partner with Merton, the one that comes to his mind is Eckhart, because he has this sense of the total emptiness of the person and the almost total union with God that occurs. So in that sense, yes. Yeah, I mean, he has high religious experience. Although when I read his stuff, it doesn't sound quite all that simple to me. But it seems a little tortured to me. I don't know if I put my hand on a passage just real quick, but it sort of seems that way to me. But we better save the mysticism when we deal with Teresa of Avila. Yes. I think that the question is asked about the merging of Eastern thought with Christianity. I think that we've had a history of this in the United States. Emerson and Thoreau dabbled in Eastern religions back in the middle of the 19th century, and we had that coming in. We've had sort of a rebirth of that, and Merton symbolizes that, and I think it's continued onward. So you read books like Zen Catholicism. Dom Aylred Graham visited the East. In fact, when Merton was going to the East, he was reading one of Graham's books along the same line, Zen Catholicism. We find various thinkers trying to put the two areas together. We see generally an attempt today to enter into honest dialogue, to look for similarities and so on. So, you can read a lot along this line now. And I think it's a very fruitful dialogue. My own opinion is that the Eastern thought for us is mostly corrective. I have met very few Westerners who could actually move into the Eastern world and let that be their worldview and mindset, and those categories take them over. And it would be most difficult to live here in the United States and do that. However, it seems to me the value is as a corrective, much as I tried to give the presentation. So Chuang Tzu's idea of not being number one all the time is a marvelous corrective to a success-oriented society. You know, our superficiality of, it's one thing Merton hated, the trivialization of important things. You know, he'll speak about tourists going through the Louvre in 2 hours or something and saying, I did the Louvre. That turned him off more than almost anything else, to see the trivializing of great and important things. And where the Western world had no time for anything, no ability to drink in, to get beneath the surface. And he saw the Eastern religions as being a corrective there again. So, you know, all these ways, I see them functioning that way. We hear about these people. I don't think it's a matter of becoming a Buddhist, but it is a matter of learning from them that God can't be categorized, that there's a proper absence of God, so that people are going through the dark night of the soul and trying to pray, and it's like ashes, and no consolation and everything, getting nothing out of it. Well, they're able to say, indeed, that's part of the genuine experience of God. The Eastern religions help to remind us of that emptiness, the nothingness that's involved. And that emptiness and nothingness leads to fullness. It's very paradoxical. All that stuff I read you, you could take any one of those stories probably and meditate on them for a while. Wouldn't it be marvelous to live like the meat cutter? Well, it's a great way to live, isn't it? Spontaneously, simply, where it flows for us. Where we don't feel tight and restricted and at odds with ourselves. Well, it seems like a marvelous kind of situation to get into. Wouldn't it be great if we didn't get bent out of shape when somebody attacks us personally or there's a slight affront? If we couldn't say, is that so? I think I'll do that tomorrow when I give a talk and I get attacked tomorrow, which will probably happen. I think I'll do that. People think I'm crazy. Is that so? But wouldn't that be neat? Instead of walking around hurt and pout, instead of pouting, say, is that so? That'd be great. We save ourselves all kind of unproductive time by not pouting. Mm-hmm. Well, I presume people heard because I heard, but maybe not over here. Question is the apparent opposition between Merton's style and letting go and the rigidity of the Trappist. One theory I will point out that some claim is that Merton needed the monastery, had to have it to protect himself against a personal anarchy, that he was in danger really of just living the life that he always lived. I mean, he really, did run around a lot. He didn't have a too disciplined a life as he talks about his days. And one theory is that he understood that he needed the monastery, that the monastery provided a home, and it provided a structure within which he could live. It's not unlike what I'm thinking of Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor said that it was her Catholicism that allowed her to write her fiction. And again, it's a structure within which we work. I don't think freedom has got to do with just total openness. Seems to me that discipline is a great part of what frees us up. Also, we discipline ourselves to get up at a particular time in the morning so that we can live. or to eat less so he can function more effectively or something. It seems to me that's why the disciplines come out. And I think Merton saw them that way. I don't think that he felt... He had a lot of problems, and those abbots gave him a tough time, and that was all there. But it never was to the point where he says, boy, I'm getting out of here. This is too much. He never felt that. That for him was home. And it was a freeing structure. I think that probably, well, who knows, but I think it's what helped him be productive. I doubt if he would have been as productive otherwise.
Was there any opposition from the Catholic Church?
Not on that. He was silenced on one occasion from Rome in connection with his writings about peace. He was told at one time that he couldn't write about that. But I think that was all too new. He was just over there. They didn't have time to find out about it. There wasn't really room for that. But he was silenced on at least one occasion, told not to write on the peace question. I think they thought monks ought to stay in monasteries and not write about Vietnam. He was very opposed to the Vietnamese War. And the other side of this, you could do a whole social justice thing on Merton. Somebody asked me, why is he the symbol of the century? One is because out of the monastery, he goes away from the world, with all this activity, and he comes out with this tremendous care for the racial problem. He writes these strong things about race, attacking white liberals, for example, for their lack of understanding of the blacks. It corresponds with black leaders and so on. It's a marvelous feel for that. One of the strongest proponents of peace, all coming out of meditation, out of solitude. It is a remarkable thing that he has put together, in which I think a lot of people are trying to do. People are trying to figure out, how can I be prayerful and the spiritual and at the same time be involved in the social justice work. And then he showed us, I think, a way to do that. So again, he's important for that reason. I should not neglect this side of the room here. Did somebody have a hand? Yes? Uh-huh. Well, I think that is where he found it. He is a Christian, and I think his life was centered on Christ, and much of the Christ figure emerges in his poetry and so on. I think, I think that we have a genuine Christian spirituality here. We don't just have what I call a theistic spirituality. It's a genuine Christian theology or spirituality, and Christ is at the center of it for him, at least implicitly, if not always stated that way. I believe that Merton saw Christ in sort of the classical sense. Who was he? I think he's the Redeemer. I think he's the one who sacrificed for us. I believe it's a very classical understanding of redemption and of satisfaction and of bringing salvation for us. There's no doubt, you see, Merton, remember when he starts out, he's very immersed in that world. He's so much involved in that to begin with that there isn't any other grace other than Christ. As he starts out, when he's converted to Catholicism in the 30s, he learned a strict Catholicism. There's grace comes only through Jesus Christ, and there isn't any other way, and he's the one mediator. So much so that it was an exclusivism. It was only Christ. So far from Christ being out of the picture, he was dominating the center of it. What I think he saw as life went on is that the grace of Christ radiated outward to other people as well, and couldn't be confined and narrowed and constricted. Well, I would say that he has a definite Christian spirituality, although I can see where comes the question in the way that I really didn't highlight that. throughout my presentation. I understand that. Of course, there's so much that this man is complex, and I've taken really just one strain, this Eastern strain. Could have done the whole talk totally different in terms of the prophetic experience or mystical experience or relationship to Jesus. Had to pick one or the other. But it's there. That's an interesting point. The question, or the point is made, comment is that Merton's contacts were vital to his growth. And that when he just withdrew, that it was hard for him. One of the first times he got out of the monastery, he got to go to Louisville. That might be one of the things you're concerned. He got to go to Louisville, and he's standing on a street corner. Suddenly, all of this sort of arrogance that he had towards other people, and this sort of looking down on people and all that melted right away with the crowds walking around. It's one good example of what you're referring to there. He suddenly felt at one with them, and he developed an empathy in that particular situation. One wonders if he would have developed it if he hadn't left the monastery that day and gone to Louisville for a doctor's appointment. Yeah. Right. That's well put. I hope people heard it. The switch that he made was in terms of his own attitude, that when he went into the monastery, the world looked pretty crummy to him, and it was a lot of it was a sense of escape, getting away from that lousy world, and that when he encountered this Louisville experience and others, he turned it around and said, maybe it's the way I look at that world, this inner attitude that counts. And I think that did happen. I wondered how he knew all this stuff, but people used to correspond with them. Daniel Berrigan would send him material, for example, about the peace movement, and he'd get letters from all over. I guess it's unbelievable the number of letters that he wrote. He was a compulsive writer. He was always writing, and the letters, they're just, I suppose Michael Mott's the only one who's seen them all, but it's just amazing. That's good. Do you know Merton from what angle? Just reading? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think so. I think they thought of him that way. I think they thought of him that way, as really possessing the Buddha consciousness. But so does everybody. Their idea is that it's all there. It's a matter that it's covered up by knowledge, by science, by all those kinds of things. What I wanted to read, the pearl of great price. Let me see if I can find that. Yeah, this is Chuang Tzu. This will catch a little of that. The Yellow Emperor went wandering to the north of the Red Water, to the Kwanlun Mountain. He looked around over the edge of the world. On the way home, he lost his night-colored pearl. He sent out science to seek his pearl and got nothing. He sent analysis to look for his pearl and got nothing. He sent out logic to seek his pearl and got nothing. Then he asked nothingness, and nothingness had it. The Yellow Emperor said, strange indeed. Nothingness, who was not sent, who did no work to find it, had the night-colored pearl. That sense of the letting go in the whole process. Yes. Why don't you speak up? Well, I'll have to repeat it anyway. Go ahead.
Christ. And I think it's in the Asian Journal to make some comments about the contrast between Christianity as content in the old form where he started himself, and then seeing it as a process, seeing Christ more as a way than a content thing. And I think he was influenced, it seems very highly, by Oriental images of process, like the process of shooting an arrow is more important than the target.
Yes. The point is made, to repeat for people, is that Merton's own attitude towards Christ changed as time went on and became more process-oriented. I might comment on that. Merton liked a lot, to get back to this other question, the idea that of the phrase, I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. That phrase to him was very significant as to what was going on. And he did indeed see that, therefore, as a process that was within, that the idea of the Christian life wasn't to conform to these rules or even to believe in Christ. In that sense, as someone out here. The process was to take on the mind of Christ, to allow Christ to sink in and to become almost one, so that the reason it would flow for him is because it was Christ acting in and through him. So that's a good connecting point here again, that he felt a lot of the Eastern thought that said you got to have Buddha consciousness and you got to experience all this and have the Satori experience, enlightenment, really corresponded to what Christians were talking about in handing one's life over to the Lord, in letting go of all of that, and of saying that Christ lives in me. Very big on that experience side of it. So, yes, I think he did come to see his Christian faith in a different way as time went on. We obviously have a lot of Merton buffs in here. That's neat. Instead of just questions, if somebody's got a neat story about Merton or something that they read about him or something, feel free to throw that in, because that's neat. People obviously know about him. Yeah? No. No, I would say that it is really far from a mystical experience. People who hear mystical experiences don't usually hear bells. That's not a usual characteristic, nor do they see visions or see the Virgin Mary. That's a very different kind of experience. Mystical experience, you notice, as he said there, it's light. Light imagery is very common. And the suffusing of everything. There's no real vision in mystical experiences. Again, I'm preempting a bit. Important experience for them, hearing the bells of Gethsemane, right? That's what you're referring to? Yeah. Very important experience and a religious experience, but not a mystical one. Remember, one of the premises, this whole series is on religious experience, and one of the things is we learned from William James that there are a variety of religious experiences, as he entitled his book. And so we're seeing different types. So today it is this sort of enlightenment, letting go experience. Another time it'll be conversion, another time mystical. And one at the end of the course we'll be able to see how there are indeed a variety of religious experiences and not just one. One of the reasons I'm reacting that way is because some people think mystical experience is the only type, and therefore they feel shut out because they never had one. But it isn't the only type, and there's a lot of other kinds of experiences, and I think it's good to see that. Joe? Yeah. Well, oh yeah. This is what interested him in him about methodology. It's one of the reasons that when he went to the East, he wanted to go to Tibet. Because Tibetan Buddhism has specialized in method. He felt they knew more about method than anybody else, method of meditation. And that's what he taught to the Dalai Lama. He was with him 3 times. And he never says in the journals exactly what he learned. It's more general in that conversation, but that's what he was after. No, Merton was big, and this is a debate throughout the whole history of theology. That is, can you induce the mystical experience, or can you only prepare for it? And I'm not sure if that's a false kind of dichotomy or not, but it is the one that has really dominated people's thinking. And I would say that probably there's a bit of both in there. You got to say that all religious experience is a gift, for sure. We don't earn it. Always comes from God. On the other hand, we have to try to prepare ourselves for it. So Merton was very big on discipline. Disciplining oneself. Very big on meditation. See, meditation is what's supposed to lead to contemplation. Contemplation is another word for our sense of just being in the presence of God. So we don't have to talk to God. We don't have to really say a lot of words or anything. We're just present to God. We rest in God. We drink Him in. We're enveloped by the love of God and so on. That is where contemplation. Meditation is a means of getting there. It's a tool. So one of the great tools is to meditate regularly. Anybody who wants to have the strong religious experiences in Merton's mind has got to work at it. And has to get ready for it. But it comes as a gift when it comes. That's one of the reasons that he was against the popularization of Zen in the United States. The problems with that was that people got into Zen, and some of you remember this in the 60s, and it sounded like an antinomianism. That is, anything goes. Man, you just feel it and do it. And people were into that. Zen, wow. And it lacked the discipline. These people in the East are into that, for 10 years. They're getting ready for it. Every day fasting, every day meditating, every day talking to their spiritual director, their guru, and so on, Zen master. So it has nothing to do with that kind of free-floating, easy kind of thing. But that was in the popular mind in the United States, and Merton didn't like that. Neither did Suzuki. Suzuki was very leery of that kind of sense. And when he talked about Buddhism to Merton and others, it was always in terms of the rigid discipline that was needed. In fact, will I be able to come up with it quickly? Story of a monk who was one of the great desert fathers. Well, it can't take forever to find this here. I found a good one here, even though I didn't find what I'm looking for. Anyway, why can't I find that? The story is of a monk who people stole stuff from him. And he, in all these stories, it's like somebody stealing out of your fruit tree, and what the monk does, he goes and gets a ladder and secretly puts it under the tree and comes back in his house so the guy stealing his fruit can get down easily and go. Or after they steal their coat, they run after him and they go give him their shirt. Well, Suzuki tells the story of the monk who they stole something, and then others came and told him who stole them, and he turned the guy in. Okay? The monk did. And then the other monks came and says, that wasn't very much like a monk should act. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't have done that. And Suzuki, then the story goes that the monk goes and lets these robbers out of jail, loosing them on society. Now, Merton interprets that positively and said, there the monk got Zen consciousness. Suzuki says, no, the monk was wrong. Problem was way back when, but he shouldn't have gone and let him out of jail. Shouldn't have let those robbers go out. Now, this is a Zen person talking. You see the crucial way, the different way you could interpret that. Suzuki's afraid that the West would hear that story and say that Zen is anti-law. that Zen just wants to let anybody do anything they want. And so he insists that he shouldn't have let him out of jail. The mistake was made way back earlier in a number of ways. Anyway, what am I on? I'm on the question of antinomianism and Zen. And I'm on the question of discipline. That's your question. The question is about meditation. And yeah, that's the way. Discipline, asceticism, silence time, meditation, all leading up so that you hope that you discover what's already there. That's what we're after, self-awareness, satori, enlightenment. So not that we drink in something from outside, but what's already inside of us is now illumined for us. And it's there. The light is ordinary. The light is there for everybody, Merton says. That's maybe one of the ways that he leads us again. It seems to me Merton does what he wanted the Zen masters to do and all gurus. That is, not to produce disciples in that sense, but to get people to experience things themselves. So that your question, I think, is the perfect way to end here, maybe. That is the upshot of it, to turn one's own life over to the Lord. Not just to admire Merton, but to surrender some of my own ego in the process and try to move towards this place where the inner light can shine a bit for us. Well, it's nice to see this large group here. We still do have more seats in here, so next week feel free to bring any friends with you, and we'll be talking about a fabulous lady, the one that is said is the most important Catholic that ever existed in the history of the United States, Dorothy Day. See you next week.
I was at a thing a couple weekends ago, and so the guy from Illinois was talking.